Welcome to the talk this evening, and thank you for your ongoing support to the OMAH History Speaker Series. A couple of thank yous before we begin. Thank you to the OMAH History Committee for their work behind the scenes to recruit our excellent speakers, to coordinate and execute all moving parts that make these talks happen. Thank you, especially to our former OMAH History Coordinator, Lindsay Earle, for recruiting our dynamic speaker for this evening, and to Monica Svagari, the Operations Coordinator at OMAH, for the excellent support she provides the History Committee, and to Deanne McCullum at Rogers for recording our history speakers for viewing on Rogers Cable, enabling us to share our talks to a wider audience. So tonight we welcome Dr. Frances Helyar as our guest speaker. She is a professor emerita at Lakehead University in Orillia. She is the founding education professor at the campus and has taught a wide range of courses to teacher candidates for 15 years. Her research specifically is in the history of education with a focus on New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada. Before her academic career, Frances was an elementary school teacher in Oshawa and a radio host, tour guide, and children's entertainer in St. John, New Brunswick. With her talk this evening, History Education Through Art, C.W. Jefferys draws the history of Simcoe County. Dr. Helyar will introduce you to C.W. Jefferys, who was an important player in the art and history community. Jefferys is best known as an illustrator of textbooks. These illustrations tell us a great deal about Simcoe County's past. Dr. Helyar's discussion about C.W. Jefferys' work focuses on his drawings depicting Simcoe County history, while also providing a fascinating glimpse into the representation of Canada's past in the early 20th century textbooks. All right, Dr. Helyar, it's on to you.
Thank you. I'm going to assume that everything's working well. Well, thank you. Thank you for your kind introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. I'd also like to thank the OMAH History Committee for the invitation to speak with you tonight. As Hannah just said, I've been retired for less than a year after teaching for 15 years at Lakehead University here in Orillia. So it's a while since I've given a lecture, and it's a long time since I've spoken to such a large audience. So a little bit nervous. And my research area is, yes, the history of education, particularly in New Brunswick, where I lived for 11 years, although I'm originally from Pickering. My research area, I'm currently finishing a book on the history of French education in New Brunswick in the first half of the 20th century. And I'm also part of a national team studying the history of teacher education in Canada, where my focus is the Atlantic region. My colleagues and I we have monthly meetings, and we constantly remark about how fun the work is. And being able to share our research is a big part of what makes it enjoyable. Tonight's topic, while not related to my normal research agenda, began as a lecture in a graduate course in the history of education that I taught, but I have added to it significantly to create tonight's focus. There we go. I've divided the lecture into 5 parts. I'd like to start by sharing a bit of the history of textbook adoption in Ontario. I always found that my students in the Faculty of Education, all of whom were prospective teachers, had little understanding of how learning materials arrived in their classrooms. Next, I'll talk about history textbooks, particularly as they existed in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, which is the time when C.W. Jefferys worked. The bulk of the lecture will be about Jefferys himself, his life as an artist, as a textbook illustrator, and as an illustrator of Simcoe County's history, particularly with regard to Ste. Marie among the Hurons. Viola Parvin wrote a book on this very topic, the history of textbook adoption, and I've borrowed from it heavily. I'd like to start with her definition, and this is a quote. The term textbook, as used here, refers to a book dealing with a definite, subject of study, systematically arranged, intended for use at a specified level of instruction, and used as a principal source of study material for a given course. Starting in the mid-19th century, the Upper Canada and later the Ontario government authorized textbooks used in publicly funded schools. The legislation had three purposes. First, to provide a supply of books at a reasonable cost. Next, to provide for uniformity in classroom instruction. And finally, to alleviate the influence of American textbook material. At the elementary school, only one textbook was approved for each subject, right across the province, one textbook. At the high school level, though, teachers could choose from multiple texts. According to legislation, a list of textbooks was published for each academic year. Teachers could use any text in the preparation of their lessons. However, it was against the law for a teacher to use a text for direct instruction or to require students, or usually their parents, to buy a book that was not authorized by the Department of Education. The penalty was usually financial. Teachers could be suspended, their salary could be reduced, or the school could lose its government grant. The list was known as Circular 14, which some teachers in the audience may remember well, since Circular 14 existed until 1995. It's now called the Trillium List, and it's available electronically. But if you could see the very top left-hand corner, if you look very closely, you'll see that it says Circular 14. So that was what the adoption document, the textbook adoption document, was called. In the late 19th and early 20th century, a group of factors led to improved school materials. Researcher Brian Osborne lists those improvements. Canadian textbook publishers became available. There weren't very many prior to the late 19th century. The mechanization of the printing press meant that publishing large numbers of books was easier. As engraving methods advanced, the cost of adding illustrations to textbooks decreased. As well, the art of lithography developed, and that allowed the production of maps, charts, and pictures in books where previously there was only text. Photography was invented. The 19th century idea of materialism became prominent, which says that history is centered on human activity, including labor, and the institutions created, reproduced, or destroyed by that activity. Honestly, I had to look that definition up because I don't study 19th century materialism. The last two factors: increased literacy. By the late 19th century, more people than ever could read. And finally, there was greater affluence than there had been. There was less poverty. Viola Parvin wrote, and I've shared the entire quote with you, "By some people, the textbook is considered indispensable and of equal importance with the teacher. By others, it is looked upon as unimportant, as an impediment to learning, or as a crutch for the poor teacher. Between these two extremes is the viewpoint which recognizes the textbook as an important tool for the teacher and is one of the chief sources of indirect experience available to the pupil." This quote spoke to me because I was one of those poor teachers in the first year of my teaching career who needed a crutch, and that textbook was invaluable. Ontario governments continually amended their procedures for deciding which textbooks to use. For example, a government-appointed commission in 1907 had suggestions about how to produce textbooks for schools. First, they recommended that they keep the method at the time they were already using in place, which was for the Department of Education to choose an author to write a book, hire a publisher, and decide on the price that parents had to pay for the book. Second, the department could prepare its own textbooks. This would cost a lot, and they'd have to convince other provinces to use the same textbook to save money. However, the British North America Act made education a provincial, not a national responsibility. So getting that kind of cooperation between the provinces was unlikely. The third option was for authors and publishers to work with the provinces to create textbooks. This would be a competitive process, providing greater incentive to produce quality books at a reasonable price. And this is the option that the government chose in 1907. I'd like to take a few minutes now to very briefly touch on history textbooks. History has always been a school subject in Ontario, although the reason for its inclusion in the curriculum shifts over time. Penny Clark writes about the purpose of history education. One is to teach history, which is one of the liberal arts, and it's a traditional discipline. Another purpose is to create good citizens. Another is to build national identity and loyalty to country. And remember this one because this will be important, as will this next one, to portray exemplar history in the form of heroes and heroines as role models for students to emulate. And then in the 1920s and 1930s, during the progressive era, to nurture the whole child. Although I would not say that Jefferys was part of that way of thinking. I did want to point out before I move on, you'll note that at times when I'm quoting directly, I'll include in the bottom right-hand corner in parentheses a name, usually a page number and a year. And that is my reference to give you a sense of who the source is for each of these direct quotes. And at the end of my slideshow, I have a reference list where you'll see Clark is listed with all the details about the publisher or the academic journal that these quotes can be found in. So that's a habit, but I did want to point that out because I know that often my students didn't know why that information was there. In the 1920s, Canada had a number of publishers who published textbooks, but the three major publishers were McClelland and Stewart, Macmillan of Canada, and the Ryerson Press. Of the three, Ryerson was the prominent publisher of history textbooks. The publisher of Ryerson Press, Lorne Pierce, according to his biographer, was, quote, convinced that Ryerson publications must be concerned with higher values, morality, and patriotism, and that they ought to stimulate national cohesion and inspiration. Lorne Pierce began working for Ryerson Press in 1920. According to his biographer, during his career, he, quote, acted on the basis of mid-20th century conceptions of nation, gender, ethnicity, and class, ones that exalted a Protestant male construct of nation, which valorized French-English entente and immigrant assimilation to a precisely defined national ideal. Lorne Pierce was a man of his time. That sentence is mine. George Wrong, and I can never get over his name, but George Wrong was a professor of history at the University of Toronto. a historian and a prolific writer, well known on the Canadian literary scene. He wrote a history textbook published by Ryerson in 1921. Lorne Pierce continued to publish the book over the years in an expanded form. And here is where we first meet the artist, C.W. Jefferys. Pictured here is a note from the textbook, The Public School History of Canada, by author George Wrong. And you'll see that he writes, "The author cherishes the hope that this little volume will make clear and interesting the story of Canada. The illustrations by Mr. C.W. Jefferys will, he is certain, further the same end." And here are a couple of illustrations by Jefferys. As publisher, Lorne Pierce wrote a foreword to the history series, to the history book, which included the passage, quote, "There is something radically wrong when so many students in our schools dislike Canadian history. There is sufficient romantic interest in the story of our nation to make such a state of affairs unwarrantable. The story of Canada offers a solution. It is written in simple, vivid narrative and dramatic style, emphasizing at all times the romance of incident and character. That is, it is a story." Lorne Pierce was a strong supporter of Canadian writers and artists who actively worked in the 1920s. According to Pierce's biographer, quote, "for a better and more autonomous Canadian culture, differentiated from that of the United States on one hand and Britain on the other," close quote. And these included, pictured here on the left, poet E.J. Pratt, in the center and on the right, historians Harold Innes and Donald Creighton. Pierce was well acquainted with the Group of Seven and commissioned several members to create book jacket covers for Ryerson Press publications. Here we see a book of poetry by Al Purdy with the cover by J.E.H. MacDonald, a member of the Group of Seven. On the left, in the center, a history booklet about Old Toronto, illustrated by MacDonald's son, Thoreau, so related to the group of, associated with the Group of Seven as a relative. He was a well-known graphic designer in his own right. And on the right, we have Frederick Varley's illustration for the cover of a novel. But the artist whose career Pierce promoted the most was C.W. Jefferys. Charles W. Jefferys was born in 1869 in England, but his family soon moved to Canada and he grew up in Toronto. He received formal training in 1884 when he attended evening classes at the Ontario School of Art. His first paying job was as an apprentice with the Toronto Lithography Company, and his work in textbooks clearly shows this influence, as we'll soon see. As a member of the Toronto Arts Student League starting in 1888, Jefferys was a key figure in the publication of the League's annual art calendars between 1895 and 1904, an event called a landmark in Canadian art. The calendar page on the right provides a sense of the early development of Jefferys' style. Jefferys worked as an artist for newspapers in Canada and the United States in the days before the wide use of photography in the news media. He spent 8 years from 1892 to 1900 as an illustrator for the New York Herald newspaper, and then he returned to Canada. During the late 19th and early 20th century, ideas about public art were changing, and Jeffreys was part of the change. Brian Osborne writes that, quote, the images considered to be nationally charged symbols had to be physically and intellectually accessible to the general public, rather than being sequestered in the drawing rooms or galleries of the elite. Close quote. Jeffreys was a contemporary of popular Canadian artists such as, clockwise here from the top left, Tom Thomson, top right, Homer Watson, Emily Carr, a familiar image, and in the lower left corner, A.Y. Jackson. Here you can see a couple of Jeffreys paintings. On the left, an untitled 1911 sketch of western sunlight at Last Mountain Lake in Saskatchewan. And on the right, Approaching Storm, Qu'Appelle Valley, which was exhibited at the Canadian National Exhibition in 1912. Jeffreys named two British artists as major influences. William Morris's work, an example on the left, has a very distinct and very widely recognized design style. Walter Crane was a well-known artist and illustrator of children's books, and we see an example of his work on the right. One of Jeffreys' major commissions on his return to Canada was to illustrate Uncle Jim's Canadian nursery rhymes for family and kindergarten use. Unfortunately, this book required 4-color printing, which was a service too expensive for Canadian publishers. Instead, it was sent to a press in London, England, which soon went bankrupt. This meant the book received virtually no distribution or marketing. Jeffreys received only one royalty check for 830 copies sold, and he never worked on this type of full-color book again. I was curious, so I looked it up. And in 2010, the value of an original copy of Uncle Jim's Canadian Nursery Rhymes was listed at $250. So you may want to check whatever storage areas you have to see if you have a copy of this book, because it is definitely rare and it looks like a beautifully made book. After 1912, Jeffreys worked with the publisher George Morang on a series of illustrations for historical biographies, and he illustrated T.C. Halliburton's Sam Slick sketches. This developed in him an interest in history, and in 1921, he was commissioned by the Ontario Department of Education to illustrate the Ontario Public School History of Canada. This served as C.W. Jeffreys' introduction to Ryerson Press publisher Lorne Pierce, and a great partnership was born. Jeffreys worked closely with Pierce for the next 30 years. Pierce's biographer writes that the two men, quote, shared a proselytizing vision of Canada's past, which Jeffreys drew and Pierce marketed successfully. She continues, Jeffreys' textbook illustrations, as well as the Ryerson volumes devoted exclusively to his historical depictions, offered tens of thousands of Canadian readers, particularly school children, a romantic, epic, and Whiggish vision of Canadian history, the incarnation of a nationalist ideology shared by author and publisher. And again, I had to look up Whiggish, but it turns out it's a concept that I'm very familiar with. It's a way of looking at history as a constantly progressive process so that human life in each historical era is better than the one that precedes it. Jeffreys' illustrations were published in textbooks from the 1930s to the 1960s. Brian Osborne writes that Jeffreys, quote, felt a responsibility to use his artistic talents to further a better appreciation of Canadian history and national identity, close quote. Lauren Pierce, the publisher, wrote of Jeffreys, quote, a teeming horde of boys and girls in thousands of schools across the land learn from C.W. Jeffreys' pictorial histories the principal characters and outstanding events of Canada's past, those things most worthy of devotion and of remembrance in this fair land. Close quote. Jeffreys' best-selling books by far, however, were the 3-volume picture gallery of Canadian history published by Ryerson Press between 1942 and 1950. As I started collecting history textbooks, this copy of Volume 1 became my favorite, perhaps because I vaguely remember it from the school library in the 1960s or 1970s. And I was talking to my 3 brothers about this talk I'm giving tonight, and my oldest brother said, without having seen this, he said, yes, I remember those books with those drawings. Jeffreys' drawings were very memorable to us as children. Now, unlike the Ontario Public School History of Canada, which I showed you a few moments ago, I can find no evidence that this picture gallery series was ever included in Circular 14. So these were not books that every child would use in their classroom, but there may be a copy in the classroom, and they could be found in school libraries. And as I look at my personal copy, it doesn't look very exciting from the outside. So I was surprised when I discovered that when originally published, at one point, the book jackets for the series created a very colorful contrast. And then, of course, when I opened my copy of the book that doesn't have these wonderful color jackets, the contents of the book were immediately recognizable as Jeffreys' illustrations. Brian Osborne notes that Jeffreys had, quote, a distinctive methodology of historical drawing. Factual drawings were accompanied by a large selection from the imaginative pictures of episodes and phases of Canada's history, which the author had made during the last 40 years. Jeffreys would stress that all of these are based on authentic historical material, close quote. Lauren Pierce's biographer describes how, quote, from the first, Pierce recognized and identified with the myth-making power of Jeffreys' images. He commissioned Jeffreys' art not just for his painstaking research into the material history of the scenes depicted, but above all for the epic and dramatic power which gave visual and visionary unity to a variety of Ryerson's publications, many of them aimed at children. Jeffreys was also a prolific writer, and he often wrote about his historical thinking. He said, quote, the history of a country is not to be read only in its written or printed records. These, while of the greatest value and importance, do not tell us all that we desire to know. Old buildings, early furniture, tools, vehicles, weapons and clothing, contemporary pictures of people, places, and events must be examined to fill out the story. Elsewhere, Jeffreys wrote, quote, opinions regarding the value of imaginative pictures inevitably will differ, but it may be claimed that they serve as a useful, if minor, purpose in arousing popular interest in historical subjects. In any case, we shall continue to have them with us, as we shall have historical novels, historical moving pictures, and popular biographies. Several themes are notable in Jeffreys' work. Brian Osborne lists them. Jefferys focused far more on Eastern Canada than on the West. He was more interested in rural settings than urban and industrial. He depicted French and Indigenous themes as well as missionaries and explorers, war, conflict, and the military. In contrast to other illustrators of his time, Osborne writes that Jefferys, quote, cannot be faulted in his sensitive awareness of the role of three constituencies often neglected in traditional history: the native peoples, the ordinary people, and women. These are given pride of place, close quote. Indeed, Osborne notes that, quote, Jefferys always referred to the significant role of his work in developing the minds of young boys and girls of Canada, and clearly he recognized the importance of the presence of female images for both genders. The 3 volumes of the Picture Gallery of Canadian History were bestsellers, with 6 printings by over 30 years. According to a history of children's illustrated books and publishing, Jefferys' drawings, quote, encouraged several generations of Canadian children to visualize Canadian history as a dramatic and romantic epic in which explorers and settlers inscribed a series of firsts upon an empty landscape. These images powerfully encouraged the reader to construct a seamless meta-narrative of progress that transformed the wilderness of New France into a civilized settler space. Now we reach the final section of my talk. C.W. Jefferys had a deep interest in Simcoe County, specifically in the history of the Jesuits and Hurons at Fort Ste. Marie, just north of us here in Orillia, west of us, and especially in the discovery in 1919 of a small cannon on Christian Island. In his unpublished work about the Jesuits in Huronia, he wrote, quote, I know not whether other students of history, amateur or professional, are afflicted with a similar habit of mind as myself, but I find such trivial things exacting a degree of attention out of all proportion to their historical significance, and abiding themselves at times when I should be concentrating upon more serious importance. It is in vain that I brush aside these interruptions. They are, as it were, mental mosquitoes continually buzzing about one's thoughts. Jefferys' Picture Gallery of Canadian History contains several images of Simcoe County locations. The 2 drawings here are based upon the drawings of others, and this is one way that, as Jefferys mentioned, that he drew, from which he drew his subjects. He would look at earlier renderings of historical places or historical items. So the top image is based of Fort Ste. Marie is based on a drawing by Father E.J. Devine, and the lower one, the ruins of St. Marie, from a sketch by Father Felix Martin. In the inset of this page from the picture gallery is a drawing of the cannon found on Christian Island in 1919. Jefferys was deeply interested in creating illustrations that were historically accurate. He asked why critical examination of written history did not translate to the same attention in illustrated history. Here we see a watercolor version of Jefferys' illustration, Champlain Discovers Georgian Bay. And in the center of the version that appeared in the Picture Gallery of Canadian History. The notes Jeffreys wrote about this image demonstrate the care he took to portray accurate details. And you should be able to make out some of these deep details in the inset on the right. He wrote, "Over Champlain's shoulder is slung a bandolier, to which are attached small tin or wooden cases, something like modern cartridges, each containing a charge of gunpowder. To load the weapon, one of these cases was detached, the top torn off, and the powder poured into the muzzle of the arquebus. A bullet was taken from the bag which hangs below the bandolier and dropped into the arquebus and pounded firmly down with a ramrod. From a flask which hung near the bullet bag, a small quantity of finer powder was poured into the touch hole at the breech of the arquebus to be fired by contact with the lighted fuse." Close quote. As this detail shows, Jeffreys was concerned about how illustrators depicted historical figures. Jeffreys took as one of his goals to educate the public about historical representations of people. He wrote, quote, "In the absence of genuine portraits from life, it is inevitable that some form of imaginative pictorial personification will come into existence. If these portraits are acknowledged to be ideal representations, the ethics of history are safeguarded. The criticism of such works must then change its approach, and the questions to be asked are whether the artist's version seems consonant with the known character of the person represented, with his occupation and his environment." Jeffreys wrote, for example, about the traditional portraits of the missionaries of New France, such as Brebeuf, saying the lips tended to be too full in contradiction to their lives of poverty. However, he also remarked that historically, missionary priests could wear beards, but they had to carefully trim the hair around the mouth so that they wouldn't spill any part of the sacrament. While Jeffreys admired the work of 19th century Canadian painter Paul Kane, shown here, he used Kane's painting Assiniboine Hunting Buffalo to provide a critique of historical drawing. He wrote that Kane's, quote, "drawing of the details of costume, of canoes, of wigwams is accurate. His portraits of Indians are full of character. They are ethnological documents of great value. But his observation of Indian characteristics seems to stop at the neck. When he depicts the full-length figure, the pose, the action, the physical characteristics all remind us of the antique. The Indian chief suggests the statue of Apollo Belvedere, beau ideal of the mid-19th century connoisseur. His horses are not Indian ponies, pintos, or cayuses, but Arab steeds, careering with the outspread legs of the racehorse of the sporting prince of the period. For the buffalo, he had no precedent, and consequently, he gives us some real construction and character to the animal, but its gallop is the same conventional ventre-à-terre. Coming back to Simcoe County, Jeffreys' depiction of Samuel de Champlain, in his mind, responds to critiques of the way the explorer was usually shown as a smug-faced man. Jeffreys writes that George Wrong, while preparing his Ontario Public School History of Canada, rejected such a depiction, saying, "The man with that face never discovered anything." I was very interested to read that Jeffreys is very critical, especially of the way Champlain was portrayed in the statue at Orillia. He writes, quote, "It represents him wearing breastplate and heavy boots reaching above the knee. Doubtless he wore boots on shipboard and on horseback in France, but certainly a seasoned voyager like Champlain never stepped into a birch bark canoe or climbed a slippery Georgian Bay rock with such footgear. It is particularly unfortunate that a monument which commemorates his explorations in the interior of Ontario should be marred by so glaring an incongruity. It spoils what is otherwise a capable and satisfactory work, albeit perhaps somewhat lacking in the vigor and simplicity which we associate with the father of New France. Close quote. I provided you with a lot of information this evening. I hope that the context of the textbook adoption process and the brief look at history textbooks were an effective springboard into a look at C.W. Jefferys' career as an historical illustrator. Jefferys' influence was strong for over 30 years. His interpretations of Canadian history were familiar to 3 generations of children. Historians have called him, quote, the dominant visual myth maker of Canada's past, close quote. One critic wrote, quote, Jeffrey's images construct a heroic Canada where the so-called noble savage has given way to a nation founded by intrepid explorers and developed by resilient French, loyalist, and prairie settlers in stirring succession. In his own words, Jeffreys wrote that he had, quote, realized that yesterday was as alive as today, and that the accurate and intensive observation of how many people acted now and here was the best way to understand how they acted in the past. While Jeffreys is not so well known today, I hope that you might continue to seek out his drawings and the books in which they were published. Most of all, I hope that we can recognize that although we may agree with Jeffreys' ideas about art and history, or we may find fault with some of the things he drew or the thoughts he expressed in writing, C.W. Jefferys' work provides strong evidence of how Canadians thought about history and history education in the 1920s and 1930s. I mentioned earlier sources. Here is a list of the primary sources I used for this lecture, and I particularly want to draw your attention to cwjeffreys.ca. This is a website that was created and is curated by Jeffreys' grandson. And here are the secondary sources that I used to build this lecture. Thank you so much for being here. I leave you with a painting that Jeffreys did of a Muskoka cottage owned by a friend of his. I do welcome your questions and comments, and I've provided my email here.
Thank you, Dr. Frances Helyar. That was wonderful. So we're going to take this time to open it up for questions. So if you have any, you can just write them in the Q&A or the chat below. So we'll get started. Looks like we already have a question. Someone asked, do you mind showing the first slide?
CW, I would love to.
Yeah.
I would love to. Let me just find it. I'll find it and then share it. Would that be the best way to?
Yeah.
Let's see. How can I do this? Oh, I'll go here. No, wait a minute. I'll go here. Okay, go back up. There we go. Okay, let me share that. Oh, screen sharing has failed to start. Oh, because, sorry about this. Let me just go back and
Okay.
I think I know what I'm doing now. I'm just not sure how to see. Oops. Are you able to share it for me?
I do not believe I have that capability.
Okay.
If you send it to me, I should be able to share it
There we
fairly quickly, and we can circle back to
Okay, let me send
it.
it to
Okay.
you quickly.
So that's
Sorry, everybody.
Sorry about it.
visitors at Aurelian
Oh,
Museum.
dear, 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 dear. Let me go to my email. While I'm doing this, I think I can multitask. Shall I take a question while I'm doing this, and I'll do my best to
I'm still waiting on some questions. Many,
okay.
many well dones and thank yous.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Let's see this copy, and I'll just paste it here. Edit, paste. There we go. La, la, la. I'm really curious to know if anybody in the audience um, remembers seeing uh, C.W. Jeffries' books in.
Someone did comment saying, I'm surprised at how many illustrations I recognized from my days at St. Marie.
Ah, yes, yes. Now, Monica, there you are, Monica. Okay, I will send this right away. Blah, blah, blah.
Someone also says, I have one of these books.
Oh, which volume do you have? I'm very curious.
And again, many others. Trish did write as well that I do recognize some of the illustrations. Oh,
They are.
Anthony Allen is here, the youngest grandson of C.W. Jeffries and the digital curator of the website you mentioned.
Oh, I'm a little starstruck. Gee, Anthony, did you get my email address? Now, Monica, I just sent you that image. Anthony, I hope you don't mind my using your website. Um, okay, let's see. Yes, it should be noted that one of the problematic details was the portrayal of natives as predominantly shirtless. Yes. And Ron says, I thought that Cop Clark was also a publishing house used for Canadian history in the first quarter of the 20th century. Yes, yes, absolutely, as was Cop Clark, Meringue, as I mentioned. But because I was dealing with Ryerson, I included the two other major publishers just to give an idea of that Ryerson was one of these big publishers that didn't just publish textbooks, but published a lot of different things. So you're absolutely right. Cop Clark, we probably all remember, well, those of us who are old enough remember Cop Clark books in our classrooms. Anthony, oh, thank you, Anthony, for your generosity. That's very much appreciated. Are we getting back oh, there's the picture, yes. That's the picture as it's cropped in the, on the slide, but it is available. I'm not sure, Anthony, if I found it from your website or if I found it from the Ontario Archives, but it's a beautiful, it's a beautiful photograph. What year was this picture taken? I believe I have that information. I'm just never sure how to, let's see if I can. I think it was around 1912. Oh, the picture is on the website. Thank you, Aunt Catherine and Betsy. So Aunt Catherine is Aunt Catherine. Aunt Catherine is the oldest, and then the baby is Betsy. Thank you so much. It's just a wonderful. My interest in these three books in volume one, which also had some filler illustrations by, oh, I missed that is that the chat? T.W. McLean, who is also a friend of many of the, yes, so T.W. McLean I'm not familiar with T.W. McLean, but thank you for pointing that out. These textbook illustrations are really textbooks are fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Let's see.
Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
Yeah, what drew you to, the history of, I guess, textbooks?
Textbooks.
Yeah,
In 25 words or less, I'll tell you the story of my master's thesis.
go for it.
Oh, Anthony says C.W. Jeffries had 5 girls, because we were last week, I was discussing with somebody why his what we would, I guess, call progressive attitude toward women. It could be that the fact that he had 5 daughters would definitely have an impact on the way he portrayed women. How I became interested in textbooks was I was doing my master's at UNB in Fredericton, and I wanted to write a history of education in New Brunswick in the 20th century, because there is a wonderful history of education in New Brunswick up to 1900. So I thought, well, I'll fill in that gap. And I very soon realized that you can't write a history of an entire century of education in a master's thesis, which is about 100, 120 pages long. And as I was doing the research, I was going through the chief superintendent's correspondence. When I got up to 1920, this textbook kept coming up, Meyer's General History. And what I discovered was in 1920, as often happened, the world history textbook, which was used in all of New Brunswick schools, a new edition was published. It was published in Boston and it was sent to New Brunswick, but because of their distribution method, it went straight to the booksellers and not to the Central Board of Education. So this edition went to all these books, small booksellers, and parents bought them. And a returned serviceman about 6 months later was looking at one of these books and realized that the chapter about World War I, this was 1920, so World War I was very fresh in everybody's mind. The chapter about World War I did not mention Canada at all. So he wrote a letter to the editor, and it became a 6-month controversy, at the end of which they had to remove all the textbooks, not just the offending textbooks, but all the textbooks written by this particular American author. And the board tried to choose a replacement textbook that would be acceptable to all, in particular to the Roman Catholic bishop, because for historical reasons, the Roman Catholic bishop had a veto over which textbooks were chosen. He felt that all the proposed textbooks were too anti-pope. And so the Board of Education had to change the curriculum so that it started at ancient history, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, up to the birth of Christ, and then picked up again with the history of Britain and Canada. And that remained so for 18 months until the American author rewrote his textbook with a paragraph in the chapter about World War I talking about how fantastic Canada was. That was my master's and my doctoral my doctoral dissertation. It's absolutely fascinating, and these stories are everywhere in the archives. So this is why my colleagues and I are we love what we do so much.
Awesome. It looks like Donna asks, the watercolor paintings he did were much like the group of 7 works from the same time. I wonder if he knew any of them.
Yes, he did. That's from the research. I think they traveled in the same circles, and it seems to me he was asked to become a member at one point. I think I'm remembering that correctly. But he did not become a member.
Interesting.
But he was most definitely, he knew them, he knew their work, and he was influenced by them.
Is there any more?
Oh, here, Anthony. He was a great friend of all the group, but especially J.E.H. MacDonald. He was invited to join, but was quite consumed by his historical work. My mother said he felt that they were a bit too constrained in their techniques.
Interesting.
that actually that to me that fits what I understand about Jeffries,
Mhm.
that he had his ideas and he wanted certainly I had never seen any of his paintings, his watercolors, and so it was very interesting
Mhm.
to see those images.
Just waiting on some more questions.
Aunt Catherine spent time with the McDonalds and claims to have seen. What did she see? The pressure's on for Anthony to finish his. Thorough MacDonald, who was MacDonald's son, Thoreau, was named after Henry David Thoreau.
Mhm.
Had seen Tangled Garden on an easel. So yeah, that's a very well-known MacDonald painting. I believe there was. Oh, here we go. Do you ever see evidence of the art having long-term influence over the reinterpretation or representation of the history textbook as they evolve? I haven't made as, thank you, Linda, for that question. I haven't made as much of a study of newer textbooks, although I do have some. I have Ontario, a good copy, a good collection of Ontario textbooks. But it seems to me that textbook illustrations are of the age in which they are created. So for example, somebody who I think had hoped to come tonight earlier this morning sent me an image from a textbook that was used in New Brunswick French schools, and it was published in the 50s, and the images in the 50s were very recognizable as sort of the Jane and Dick See Spot Run. If you can picture, those of us who grew up looking at those, we can imagine what those children look like in those images. And textbooks today do not look like those. They don't look like Dick and Jane or Spot. So there is a changing in the art that's representative. Also, I would say that the development of technology and the development of photography and digital art, it has changed textbooks. I should also mention that textbooks it used to be that you would make sure that you had a class collection of textbooks in your classroom, so one for every student. But historically, textbook publishers would change there'd be a new edition regularly, and this certainly happens at the post-secondary level. Almost every year there's a revised edition, which means that your students who bought the textbook last year can't sell it to somebody this year because we're using a new edition. So that the kind of change has means that with the expense, it's less common to see a whole class set of textbooks. There are the use of smart boards and other technology, iPads and so on, mean that children you don't have to have that set of textbooks, which environmentally, I've got a set of a classroom set of New Brunswick textbooks in my garage, and I don't know how to dispose of them because I don't want to, I'm just not sure what to do with them. And I know that they were discarded out of school in New Brunswick, and I've tried to find people in New Brunswick who would want a classroom set of that particular textbook. But in terms of the design and the images, I think if you look at it over time, the production techniques change, and history things are discovered, and so images change. But certainly the Whiggish, the idea of history as progress, is questioned today, and I think that has made its way into some of the images that children see today. He showed us, oh, Alice, thank you, Alice, where Jefferys modeled his drawing on a painting. Beyond that, where did he find details about clothing and objects? Did he visit historical sites to ensure accuracy? Yes. My understanding is that he did. Definitely St. Marie, he went there a lot, but he also he would look at, for instance, the drawings, the drawings, one of them was from the 19th century, and he took that and turned it into a lithography, lithographic image. But he used a lot of different sources to get as close as he could to what he understood would have been historically accurate. It was not his imagination. At times he had to use his imagination, but he was very meticulous. And Linda here says, my 90-year-old mother and her twin sister were born in Owl House in Toronto, Cabbagetown, the home C.W. Jefferys' father built. Wow. It's wonderful. So Jefferys it just seems that Jefferys is, if we look, we can still find his influence. He was commissioned as a historical consultant for the reconstruction of Port Royal. Anthony, I think you and I have to have lunch together or something. But thank you so much.
Are there any other questions? All right. So I'm going to hand it over to Trish, and she's going to do a send-off.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for your attendance tonight and your ongoing support of the OMAH Speaker Series. And a very special thank you to Dr. Helyar for being our guest speaker tonight and sharing with us your fascinating research, not only on the history of education and the adoption of Canadian textbooks in schools, but also to learn about C.W. Jefferys himself, his career, his contributions. He was clearly a very talented man, very progressive man who used his artistic talents to create and include in Canadian textbooks those I like the term pictorial histories that you use. He does a lovely job of capturing that. And also our local history here in Simcoe County was also very fascinating as well. So thank you so much for sharing that and being with us here tonight. Be sure to join us on May 15th at 7 p.m. via Zoom, where our next speaker, Dave Dawson, will present Evolution, the Packet's Death Spawns Birth of the Digital Newspaper. The Aurelia Packet and Times, published in Aurelia since 1870, was an important part of the fabric of our community. Citizens depended on the packet to keep them abreast of what was happening locally. Imagine the outrage and disappointment when, with no notice to staff or the community, after 144 years of faithful service, the packet shut its doors on November 25th, 2017. Dave will speak on the relationship of the packet to our community, its foundational importance to good journalism, and the growth of Aurelia Matters. And then on June 19th, we will have Amanda Marino from the Stephen Leacock Museum join us to present a Leacock love story. So don't forget to register for both talks on the OMAH website. And as chair of the History Committee, I also want to acknowledge the contributions of our committee in bringing the speaker series to you. Thank you to Marianne Grant, Janet Houston, Fred Killeen, Vicki Pavis, and Ron Nash. I would also like to thank Monica Sagveri for her assistance with the speaker series registration and PR, as well as handling the Zoom. Monica is heading out on maternity leave at the end of the week, and we send her our very best wishes at this very special time. We welcome Vanessa Santella, who will be managing these responsibilities moving forward. And please know that email reminders will now be sent out twice monthly, the first and third Mondays of each month, that has a history speaker event. If you wish to stay informed on our speaker series calendar, you can subscribe. There will be a link sent out in the follow-up email from this talk that includes the survey. So please sign up and you'll receive those reminders in your email basket. So thank you again for your ongoing support, and we look forward to seeing you in May. Have a good evening. Thank you.